The story begins with a group of friends sitting around a campfire on the edge of a dense forest, sharing the kind of true tales that always leave everyone with chills long after the fire has gone out. One of them, a quiet young man named Kyle, hesitated before telling his story, a story he'd never fully shared with anyone else. He started softly, his voice low, almost swallowed by the crackling of the fire, and his friends leaned in, suddenly captivated by his unease. It happened 3 years ago. Kyle was still living with his parents in an old farmhouse on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place that could have felt cozy in daylight, but somehow became sinister at night, especially in winter when the wind shrieked like a living thing around the house. Kyle's room was upstairs, with a window that overlooked a field stretching into a line of trees. Every night, his bedroom grew cold, with a chill that seemed to seep up from the floorboards. At first, he thought it was a draft, but the coldness felt different, almost like a presence creeping up to the edge of his bed. One night, as he lay there trying to ignore the chill, he heard a quiet knock on his window. It was light, almost imperceptible, and he wondered if it was the sound of a branch brushing against the glass. But there were no trees close enough. Curious and slightly unnerved, he got up and peeked out. There was nothing there. He went back to bed, laughing at himself. But just as he was about to close his eyes, the knock came again. This time, it was louder. When he looked out, there was something, a dark shape standing in the field, just at the edge of the trees. He blinked, thinking it was a trick of his mind, maybe a shadow. But as he watched, it moved, shifting its weight from side to side, its form human but wrong somehow, elongated in the dark. He tried to shake it off, convinced he was half asleep. He closed the blinds and crawled back into bed. The next morning, he dismissed it as a dream and went about his day. But the following night, just as he was drifting off, he heard the knock again. This time, it was insistent, rhythmic, like someone gently tapping their nails against the glass. He pulled the blinds back, and his heart stopped. The figure was there again, only closer, standing in the middle of the field. It was hard to see clearly in the moonlight, but the shape had shoulders that seemed too wide, arms that dangled just a little too long. He couldn't see its face, but he could feel its gaze as though it were watching him intently. Frightened now, he stepped back and closed the blinds again, his hands trembling. He told himself it was just a trick of his mind, a shadow created by his imagination. But he couldn't ignore the unease that had settled in his chest. The third night, he stayed up, determined to catch this thing, whatever it was, and prove to himself that it was nothing. But when the knock came, he froze, unable to move. It was louder, more forceful, like someone drumming their fist against the window. He forced himself to look, and this time the figure was standing just outside his window, close enough that he could see its features, or lack of them. The face was blank, a smooth, pale surface without eyes, nose, or mouth. It was as if someone had wiped it clean, leaving only an empty expanse of skin. And yet he could feel it staring at him, feel the weight of its gaze pressing down on him. Paralyzed, he stared back, unable to move or cry out. The thing lifted one hand, long and bony, and tapped a single finger against the glass, slow and deliberate. Kyle stumbled back, his heart racing, and tripped over a chair, crashing to the floor. He lay there, his body trembling, listening to the silence that followed. When he finally dared to look up, the figure was gone, leaving only the faint smudge of a handprint on the glass. He didn't sleep for the rest of the night, and as dawn broke, he left his room, deciding to tell his parents. But when he went to his mom, she only laughed and told him it was a nightmare. Frustrated and terrified, he spent the day trying to shake off the fear, but as night fell, the dread crept back, settling deep in his bones. He knew it would come again. When the knock sounded that night, he didn't even look. He sat on the edge of his bed, clutching a flashlight, the only weapon he had. The knock grew louder, more insistent, until it was a relentless pounding that shook the window pane. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. Silence filled the room, and he dared to hope it was over. But as he let out a shaky breath, the closet door creaked open. His stomach dropped, and he whipped the flashlight around, shining it into the darkness. Standing there in the shadows was the figure, its featureless face tilted as if studying him. He couldn't move, couldn't scream. It began to step forward, its body contorting in impossible angles, limbs bending like a puppet's. The flashlight flickered, casting strange shadows that seemed to twist and writhe around it. The The thing stopped at the edge of his bed, reaching out with one long, thin finger, and touched his shoulder. The cold seeped into his skin, spreading through his body like ice. He felt his breath leave him, felt his heart slow, as if it were pulling the life from him. The last thing he remembered was its face, or rather the space where a face should have been, hovering inches from his own, an endless void that seemed to pull him in. He blacked out, waking up in his bed the next morning with the memory of the cold still clinging to him. After that night, the knocking stopped, but the fear remained. His parents noticed the change in him, the way he'd jump at the slightest sound, the dark circles under his eyes. He eventually moved out, hoping the thing wouldn't follow him. But sometimes, late at night, he swears he hears it again, that faint knock on the window, as if it's reminding him that it's still out there, watching, waiting. Kyle finished his story, his face pale, his hands shaking slightly. The fire crackled, the only sound in the silence that followed. His friends glanced around uneasily, some of them laughing nervously, dismissing it as just another ghost story. But as they packed up to leave, one of them pulled him aside, his face serious. "Last night at the cabin," he whispered, "I swear I heard someone knocking on my window." Years ago, Ellie, a young woman with a love for urban exploration, was drawn to an abandoned, decaying hospital on the outskirts of town. It was notorious for strange occurrences, and while most locals avoided it, stories about its dark history only intrigued her. The hospital had been shut down after a string of bizarre incidents, the most famous being the sudden disappearance of 3 nurses and a patient. No one was ever found, and soon after, the hospital closed its doors for good. Determined to explore it, Ellie set off one late October evening, armed with only a flashlight and her phone. The entrance was locked, but she found a broken window on the ground floor, just big enough to crawl through. She climbed in, her footsteps echoing through the empty halls. Dust floated in the air, and the smell of mold and decay hung thick. Shadows from her flashlight danced across the walls, revealing faded posters and broken hospital beds. Ellie made her way to the 4th floor, where the rumors said most of the strange things had happened. It was silent, oppressively so. As she moved through the halls, she could hear the faint creak of the old buildings settling and the occasional skitter of rats in the dark. But she was used to old buildings and the sounds they made. Then she heard it, a soft, distant hum, like someone singing. It was faint but unmistakable. She stopped, holding her breath, and strained to listen. The humming was coming from down the hall, from one of the patient rooms. Heart-pounding, she followed the sound, telling herself it was just her mind playing tricks. The humming led her to room 407. The door was slightly ajar, and as she approached, she could see faint movement inside. Her hand shook as she pushed the door open wider, her flashlight trembling in her grip. In the corner of the room sat a figure, a woman thin and pale with stringy hair hanging over her face. She was dressed in an old nurse's uniform, and her head was bowed as she hummed a soft, eerie lullaby, her hands clutching something Ellie couldn't see. "Hello?" Ellie whispered, her voice barely audible. The humming stopped. The figure lifted her head slowly, revealing hollow, sunken eyes that seemed to stare straight through Ellie. The woman's face was gaunt, as if she hadn't eaten or seen daylight in years. Her lips parted in a thin, unsettling smile. "You came back," the nurse whispered, her voice hoarse. Ellie took a step back, her skin prickling. I think you're mistaken," she stammered, glancing toward the door, planning her escape. The nurse's smile faded, and her expression twisted with anger. "You left us here," she hissed, clutching her hands together tightly. Ellie's flashlight flickered, and in that split second she saw it. The nurse was holding a small, dirty doll, its face smudged, with patches of hair missing. The doll's eyes, glassy and dull, stared at Ellie as if they too were alive. "Please, I don't know you," Ellie said, inching toward the door. The nurse's grip on the doll tightened and her eyes darkened. "They all say that, but you promised you'd come back." Her voice grew louder, filled with rage, as she stood up, her movements slow and unnatural. Ellie turned and bolted, racing down the hallway. The flashlight flickered again, and she could hear the faint sound of footsteps behind her. Slow at first, but gaining speed. She glanced over her shoulder and saw the nurse standing in the hallway, her head tilted, watching her with that same empty, menacing smile. She burst through the stairwell door and hurtled down the steps, her footsteps echoing off the walls. Just as she reached the second floor, she heard a sound that stopped her in her tracks. "Come back, Ellie," the voice sang, carrying through the empty halls. It was high-pitched, childlike, and it sounded like it was coming from all around her. Ellie whipped around, her breath catching in her throat. The stairwell was empty, but a faint shadow moved just beyond the doorway to the hall. She raised her flashlight, but the beam barely penetrated the dark. Then she heard it again, the sound of laughter, soft and echoing, and then a faint voice. "You can't leave. You promised." Panicked, Ellie sprinted down the stairs, heading back to the window she'd come through. She was almost there when something caught her eye, a small object on the floor in front of the exit. It was the same doll she'd seen in the nurse's hands, now lying face up, its glassy eyes staring up at her. It shouldn't have been there. She had left the nurse all the way up on the 4th floor. Her pulse raced as she backed away, her eyes darting around, searching for any sign of movement. But then from behind her she heard soft footsteps, drawing closer and closer, slow and deliberate. She didn't dare turn around. She knew who it was. "You can't leave," the nurse's voice whispered, so close it felt like ice on the back of her neck. Ellie let out a strangled scream and scrambled for the window, climbing through it and tumbling onto the ground outside. She didn't stop running until she was halfway down the road, the hospital fading behind her into the darkness. She never returned to that place. But sometimes late at night when she was alone in her room, she'd hear that soft humming again, faint and distant, as if it were drifting from somewhere just outside her window. And each time she'd find something small and chilling left in her room. A dusty doll, a faded hospital band with her name on it, or a scrap of fabric from an old nurse's uniform. Ellie eventually moved far away, leaving everything behind. But no matter where she went, the humming always followed, and each time she heard it, it felt like a reminder, a promise she'd broken to something that would never let her forget. A young couple, Mia and Jack, had just moved into a remote house at the edge of town. They'd wanted to escape the chaos of the city, and when they found the house nestled near the woods, they thought it was a dream come true. But as they were unpacking, an older neighbor stopped by, giving them a strange look. "You're brave to move in there," he said, shaking his head. "People don't stay in that house for long." They brushed it off as local superstition, thinking it was just small-town gossip meant to spook newcomers. But the first night they stayed in the house, Mia woke up to the sound of whispering. She thought it was the wind, but when she sat up, she realized the sound was coming from inside the room. The whispers were faint, unintelligible, but they sounded like multiple voices, murmuring in a low, frantic tone. Mia tried to wake Jack, but as soon as she shook him, the voices stopped and the room fell silent. She convinced herself it was just her imagination and went back to sleep. The next night, Mia woke again, but this time to the sound of someone moving in the hallway. She got up, thinking maybe Jack was up, but she found him fast asleep beside her. When she opened the door, the hallway was empty, but the sound of footsteps continued, moving down the stairs, each step slow and deliberate. Her heart pounded as she followed the sound, creeping down the staircase into the living room. She flicked on the light, but there was no one there. Just as she was about to turn back, she noticed something on the floor. Wet footprints leading from the back door to the center of the room. That's when she saw it. Just beneath the living room window, the wall was smeared with something dark. It looked like words, scrawled in shaky, dripping letters. She could barely make it out, but when she stepped closer, her stomach dropped. It read, "I see you." The words were written in what looked disturbingly like blood. Mia screamed, waking Jack, who rushed downstairs. But by the time he got there, the writing was gone, leaving only the faint smell of iron in the air. She tried to explain, but he just held her, whispering that it was just a nightmare, that she was stressed from the move. Over the next few days, the occurrences only got worse. The whispers grew louder each night, the footsteps more pronounced. Doors they had locked would creak open on their own, and objects would go missing, only to turn up in strange places. Mia found her shoes at the edge of the woods one morning, neatly placed as if someone had left them there for her to find. Jack's wallet was discovered in the attic, though neither of them had even been up there. One night, Jack woke up to find Mia standing in the middle of their room, her back to him, her head tilted toward the door. He called her name, but she didn't respond. When he touched her shoulder, she turned to him with blank, unfocused eyes, as if she didn't see him at all. "Mia, what are you doing?" She stared past him, her voice hollow and monotone. "He's waiting for us." "Who?" Jack asked, shivering. But Mia didn't answer. She blinked, and the vacant expression left her face as she looked at Jack in confusion, not remembering why she was standing there. The final straw came just a few days later. Mia was cleaning the basement when she noticed a small, door-sized outline in the far wall. She hadn't noticed it before, and it looked like it had been covered over hastily. Curious, she pried at the edges until, with a creak, a small, narrow door swung open, revealing a hidden room no larger than a closet. Inside the room, there was nothing but darkness. She shone her flashlight inside and gasped as the light fell on a withered old chair. Dried bloodstains covered the walls, thick and smeared, with scratch marks trailing down in desperate lines. And then she saw something that sent a chill through her entire body, a message scrawled in a childlike hand, etched into the wall. It read, "Don't let him in." Just then she heard a voice right behind her, soft, barely above a whisper. "He's here." Mia spun around, but there was no one there. Heart racing, she fled up the stairs, leaving the door open behind her. That night, the whispers were relentless. She and Jack lay in bed, clutching each other as the voices echoed through the house. The footsteps were back, pacing up and down the hallway outside their door, moving closer with each pass. Then a loud, rhythmic knocking began at their bedroom door. Knock, knock, knock. Mia and Jack held their breath, too terrified to move. The knocking grew louder, more frantic, as if something or someone was desperate to get inside. Then the whispers began again, right outside the door. "Let me in! Please, let me in!" The door handle jiggled, and Mia could feel her pulse pounding in her ears. Just as she thought her heart would burst, the whispers stopped and the room fell silent. She and Jack lay still, barely daring to breathe, but the silence didn't last. From behind the door came the sound of something scratching, a slow, agonizing scrape like nails dragging across wood. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, until finally it stopped with a heavy thud, followed by a chilling whisper. "You can't keep me out forever." The next morning, Mia and Jack left without a word. They packed whatever they could carry and never returned to that house. When they told the realtor they were moving, she simply nodded, as if she had expected it all along. Months later, a new family moved in, hoping to turn the house into a fresh start. They never questioned the faint dried stains on the basement wall or the strange hidden door that wouldn't stay shut. And on their first night, when they heard the soft, insistent knocking from outside their bedroom, they brushed it off as just the house settling. But as they would soon find out, some doors were never meant to be opened. And once you do, they never quite close again. There was a man named Tom who lived in a small town where everyone knew everyone. He had a job in the city, so he would often get home late, long after the streets were empty and dark. His house was a simple, single-story home at the edge of a dense forest. Tom was a no-nonsense guy, a skeptic when it came to ghost stories, and he'd always prided himself on never being spooked by the odd sounds and shadows in the woods at night. One evening, after a long, grueling day at work, he was driving home when he saw something strange on the side of the road. A figure in tattered clothes stood just outside the forest, facing away from the road. It was too dark to make out any details, but the person seemed to be completely still, almost like a statue. Tom slowed his car, squinting into the darkness. As he drove past, he caught a glimpse of the person's face in his rearview mirror, a pale face with eyes staring directly at him. He shook his head, chalking it up to exhaustion. But the moment he turned onto his street, his headlights caught something at the edge of his property. There, standing on the front lawn, was the same figure. This time, they were facing his house, completely still, their eyes blank and unblinking. Tom's blood ran cold. He drove slowly, thinking it must be some sort of prank, but as he pulled into his driveway, the figure was gone. There was only the dark, empty yard and the quiet hum of the night. He laughed nervously, feeling silly for letting his mind run wild. Still, the memory of that pale, blank face lingered in his mind as he went inside, double locking the door behind him. That night, Tom lay in bed, feeling an uneasy stillness in the air, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Just as he was starting to drift off, he heard soft footsteps outside his window, the crunch of leaves and the faint scrape of shoes against the gravel path that led to his front door. His heart raced, and he forced himself to sit up, listening. The footsteps grew louder, slower, as if someone were taking deliberate steps, drawing closer to his door. Summoning his courage, he crept to the window and peered outside, but he saw nothing, just the empty yard and the outline of trees against the night sky. But the footsteps didn't stop. They moved around the house, circling, slow and relentless. Then a soft knock echoed from the front door. Tom froze, the hair on his arms standing on end. He waited, hoping he'd imagined it. But after a moment, the knocking came again, louder this time, insistent. He tried to calm himself, telling himself it was a prank or a lost traveler. He opened the door a crack, but no one was there. Just the empty, quiet night. He barely had time to close the door before a knock came from the back door. This time, harder, more desperate. Heart pounding, he moved through the house, flipping on every light. But every time he opened a door, he was met with nothing but the cool night air. The knocking continued, moving from one door to another, always one step ahead of him. It seemed impossible, like someone was moving faster than humanly possible around his house, taunting him. Finally, he closed all the doors and windows, turning the locks until his hands shook. But as he leaned against the front door, trying to catch his breath, he heard it. A soft, faint whisper coming from right outside. "Let me in." The voice was thin, dry, like someone who hadn't spoken in years. Tom's skin prickled as he realized the voice was familiar. It sounded exactly like his own. Heart racing, he backed away from the door, shaking his head, trying to convince himself he was dreaming. The voice came again, louder this time. "Let me in, Tom." He stumbled back, feeling his chest tighten as he heard his own name spoken in that hollow, twisted version of his voice. He glanced at the window and caught sight of a figure standing just beyond the glass, staring directly at him. It was himself, his exact reflection, down to the last detail, except the eyes were wrong. They were empty, black voids, staring back at him with a hunger that seemed to reach through the glass. Paralyzed, Tom watched as the figure reached up, pressing its hand against the window, fingers pale and thin, leaving a smudge that looked like dried blood. It grinned, an unnatural, twisted smile that stretched far too wide, showing rows of teeth that looked sharper than his own. Unable to look away, he heard the voice again, but this time it was right beside his ear, whispering in a low, mocking tone. "Let me in, Tom. I'm so tired of being out here." In sheer terror, he backed away from the window, feeling his heart race as he ran to his room, locking the door behind him. He huddled in the corner, barely daring to breathe, listening to the faint scratching and tapping as the figure circled his house, knocking on the walls, whispering his name over and over. The next morning, he finally summoned the courage to leave his room. Sunlight streamed through the windows, and everything looked normal, as if nothing had happened. But as he went to make coffee, he noticed something on the front door, a handprint smeared in dark, dried blood. Tom didn't sleep much after that. Every night, the knocking returned, relentless and patient, followed by that familiar, twisted voice that called to him, asking to be let in. Some nights he could even see his own reflection in the window, staring back at him with that same empty grin, waiting for the moment he'd open the door. No one in town saw Tom much after that. He stopped coming to work, stopped answering calls, and then one day his house stood empty, a for sale sign posted in the yard. When curious neighbors went inside, they found the house in perfect condition, save for one thing. The front door was covered in dozens of handprints, each one smeared in dark, dried blood. A young woman named Emma moved into a modest studio apartment in an old building downtown, thrilled to have her own place. She was a recent college graduate and couldn't afford much, so the worn carpets, yellowing walls, and slightly musty smell didn't bother her. The rent was cheap, and the landlord told her the building had history, which she found charming. The only strange thing was that her apartment had no windows, just 4 walls, a bathroom, and a kitchen nook. She figured it would make the place cozy. Her first night was uneventful. She unpacked, set up her bed, and fell asleep quickly, lulled by the quiet stillness of the windowless room. But on the second night, she woke to the distinct sensation of being watched. Her eyes darted around the darkness, but everything seemed in place. Telling herself it was just nerves, she eventually drifted back to sleep. The following night, as she lay in bed, a soft scraping sound started from somewhere in the room. She froze, listening as the faint scratching grew louder, then stopped abruptly. She held her breath, telling herself it was the pipes or some other innocent sound that old buildings make. Still, her skin prickled with an uncomfortable feeling she couldn't shake. The next night, just as she was about to fall asleep, she heard a quiet voice, barely a whisper, coming from somewhere in the room. "Help me." The word sent a chill down her spine. She sat up, straining to listen, but the room was silent again. She turned on every light, checking every corner, even looking under her bed. Finding nothing, she sat on the edge of her mattress, heart pounding, wondering if her mind was playing tricks on her. But over the next few nights, the whispering continued. Sometimes it was close, right beside her ear. Other times, it came from the far corner of the room. The voice was always the same, faint, desperate, and pleading. "Help me. Please." Emma could barely sleep, haunted by the voice that echoed through her mind even in daylight. She confided in her friend, who suggested she might be hearing noises from a neighboring apartment. But Emma wasn't convinced. The voice was always in her room, filling the silence like a presence she couldn't see. One night, exhausted and desperate, she shouted, "Who are you? What do you want?" Silence. Then, just as she was about to give up, the voice whispered back, "I'm here," behind the wall. Emma felt a wave of dread wash over her as her eyes drifted to the far wall. She'd never paid much attention to it before, but now she couldn't look away. The wall seemed darker, almost damp in places, with faint marks she hadn't noticed before. Gripped by a morbid curiosity, she moved closer, pressing her ear against the wall. At first, she heard nothing. But then, just as she was about to pull away, the scratching resumed, louder and more frantic, as if someone were trapped, clawing to get out. Panicked, she backed away, her heart racing. She called the landlord the next day, demanding answers about the building. He was evasive, muttering something about old tenants and dismissing her fears as overactive imagination. But she could hear the strain in his voice, the way he seemed almost afraid. That night, she lay awake, watching the wall, waiting. Around midnight, the scratching started again, more intense than ever. The voice grew louder, the words clearer. "Please, let me out. I'm still here." Unable to stand it any longer, Emma grabbed a hammer from her toolbox and approached the wall, her hand trembling. She struck it once, then twice, plaster crumbling to the floor. As she tore at the wall, a foul odor filled the room, thick and sickly sweet. Her stomach churned, but she couldn't stop. Finally, after one last desperate swing, a hole opened in the wall, revealing a small, hidden space behind it. In the beam of her flashlight, she saw a pile of tattered clothes, brittle and yellowed, along with a crumbling diary bound in leather. She reached in, hands shaking, and flipped through the fragile pages. The entries told the story of a woman who had lived there decades ago, trapped by a man she trusted. The diary ended abruptly, the last words scrawled in desperate, shaky handwriting. "He's coming back. I don't know if anyone will ever find me." Emma's hand shook as she lowered the diary, feeling the chill of realization wash over her. But then she heard something else, a faint, wet, gurgling noise. She shone her flashlight deeper into the dark hole, and there, just beyond the pile of clothes, she saw something she couldn't unsee. A shriveled, skeletal hand, curled as if reaching out, fingers twisted and frozen in agony. Her scream echoed through the empty room, and she stumbled back, horrified. As she backed away, the voice came again, louder, furious. "Why didn't you help me sooner?" Emma fled the apartment that night, leaving everything behind. She moved in with a friend and never returned, too traumatized to face what she'd found. The landlord listed the apartment as vacant, never mentioning the history to prospective renters. But to this day, tenants don't stay for long. They all report the same thing, a faint, desperate whisper that echoes through the walls late at night, pleading for release that will never come. And in the quietest hours when the building is silent, some say you can still hear the faint, frantic scratching of fingers clawing for freedom, forever trapped behind the walls. A couple named Mark and Jenna had just moved into a quaint old house on the edge of town. It was an old Victorian with charm, high ceilings, and floors that creaked in just the right places. They loved the character of the house, even if it needed a few repairs here and there. What they didn't know was that the house had been abandoned for over 50 years and had a dark, lingering history. Their first few nights were peaceful, the kind where you still feel the thrill of being in a new place. But on the fourth night, Jenna woke up in the middle of the night with a strange feeling that someone was watching her. She looked around the room and saw nothing, so she brushed it off as her mind adjusting to the new surroundings. But the feeling lingered, unsettling her in a way she couldn't shake. Over the next few nights, both Mark and Jenna began noticing strange things. Objects would go missing and turn up in odd places. The kitchen light would flicker, though the rest of the house was fine. Sometimes, late at night, they'd hear soft footsteps above them, but when they checked the attic, it was empty. One evening, Mark went into the basement to check on the boiler, which had been acting up. As he was tinkering with it, he noticed a small door on the far side of the basement wall that they hadn't noticed before. Curious, he pulled out his flashlight and went over to it. The door was small, almost child-sized, and the wood was dark and rotting with age. He opened it and shined his flashlight inside, revealing a cramped, narrow passageway that seemed to go down even deeper into the ground. There were strange symbols scratched into the walls, and an awful, rotten smell wafted up from the darkness. Unnerved, he closed the door and went back upstairs, not wanting to tell Jenna and worry her. That night, Jenna was awoken by a soft, barely audible whispering. She couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like a child, voice faint and pleading. Shivering, she sat up and listened. The whispering grew louder, echoing through the walls until it seemed to surround her. Just as she was about to wake Mark, the whispering stopped. But then she heard the unmistakable sound of something scratching on the wall, right next to her bed. It was as if tiny fingernails were dragging down the wallpaper, scratching over and over, leaving invisible marks she could almost feel. Her heart pounded as she lay frozen, clutching the covers and trying to convince herself it was just a dream. The next morning, Jenna insisted that they call someone to investigate the noises and the strange occurrences. Mark reluctantly agreed, thinking it would at least give her peace of mind. They hired a local historian and paranormal investigator who specialized in old houses, hoping she'd be able to explain the odd things they'd been experiencing. When the woman arrived, she immediately seemed uneasy. She walked around the house, stopping in certain rooms and staring at the walls as if she could see something hidden within them. When she reached the basement and saw the small door, her face turned pale. "This house," she began, hesitating as if choosing her words carefully. "There's a story about it. Decades ago, a family lived here, a couple with a young daughter. They say the girl went missing one night and was never found, though some people believe she died here, hidden somewhere in the house." Jenna's heart raced, and she glanced at Mark, both of them feeling a chill settle over them. "There were rumors," the investigator continued, her voice barely a whisper, "that the parents locked her in the basement when she misbehaved, but after she disappeared, people would still hear her crying at night, scratching at the walls, calling for help. No one wanted to stay here after that." Mark and Jenna felt a new, deeper fear settling over them. That night, they could barely sleep, listening for every sound, every creak, every whisper. And then, around midnight, the scratching started again, soft at first, then louder, closer. It seemed to move along the walls, like someone or something was trying to claw its way out. Finally, unable to take it anymore, Mark got out of bed, grabbed a flashlight, and marched down to the basement. Jenna followed, clutching his arm. The scratching continued, louder and more frantic, echoing through the walls as if it were surrounding them. He opened the small door in the basement wall, and this time, they both saw it. A small, hidden room, barely big enough for a child to stand in. As they shined the flashlight inside, they saw scratch marks along the walls, long, desperate grooves etched into the stone. And there, in the far corner, was a small, dusty doll, its eyes blank and staring, and a tiny handprint smeared on the wall. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, trapping them in the pitch darkness. Jenna screamed as the scratching grew louder, surrounding them on all sides. They could feel it. Small, cold hands brushing against them, clawing at their skin, pulling them down. The flashlight flickered and died, and in the suffocating dark they heard the faint, sorrowful voice of a child. "Why did you leave me?" it whispered, close to their ears, full of anger and grief. "Why won't you help me?" The next morning, their friends came by the house after they didn't answer their calls. They found the place empty, eerily silent, with no sign of Mark or Jenna. The only thing they found was the small door in the basement, slightly ajar, and inside, 2 sets of fresh scratch marks etched into the walls. Marks that hadn't been there before. To this day, neighbors say that at night, if you stand outside that house, you can hear faint voices through the walls, pleading, whispering, begging to be let out. There was a story that circulated around a small, quiet town about a local man named Ben who had disappeared without a trace a few years back. Ben was known for exploring abandoned places, especially old buildings on the outskirts that the townspeople left alone. His last adventure was in an old, decaying hospital that had been closed for over 40 years, a place where people swore they saw shadows in the windows and heard faint voices on still nights. But Ben, being skeptical of ghost stories, couldn't resist the temptation to explore it alone. Ben went in during daylight, expecting to be out by sundown. He took his flashlight, his camera, and a backpack, determined to capture the hospital's eerie remains. As he made his way through the empty corridors, he took pictures of rusted equipment, abandoned gurneys, and patient files scattered across the floor. Every step he took echoed through the silence, but it didn't bother him. In fact, he found the silence soothing. But then, somewhere down the hall, he heard a faint sound, like the scuffing of shoes on the floor. He stopped, listening. He was alone. Or at least, he thought he was. The scuffing sound grew louder, now accompanied by a faint whisper, unintelligible and raspy, as if someone were struggling to speak. His stomach twisted. He aimed his flashlight down the hallway, but there was nothing, only peeling wallpaper and shadows cast by broken windows. Just as he was about to turn away, his flashlight flickered, and in the brief darkness, he thought he saw a figure at the end of the hall, standing just far enough away that he couldn't make out any details. Ben tried to laugh it off, telling himself it was his mind playing tricks. He adjusted his flashlight and continued down the corridor. But as he passed each room, he had the distinct feeling that someone was following him, slipping into the shadows every time he turned around. His heart pounded, but he kept moving, determined not to let the fear get to him. Finally, he reached a door marked Morgue at the end of a dark, narrow hallway. He felt a shiver run down his spine, but couldn't resist the pull of curiosity. He pushed the door open, and the smell hit him, a musty, stale odor that seemed to cling to the air like something rotting. Inside were rows of old metal drawers for the bodies, some slightly ajar, revealing the dark, empty spaces within. Suddenly, his flashlight flickered again, casting the room in brief, unsettling bursts of light and shadow. In one of those flickers, he caught a glimpse of something, a face, pale and twisted, staring at him from inside one of the open drawers. Its mouth was stretched in a silent scream, eyes hollow and sunken. Ben stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. The light flickered on fully, and the face was gone. The drawer was empty. But as he turned to leave, the door slammed shut. He bolted to it, pulling and pushing, but it wouldn't budge. A soft whisper filled the room, growing louder, words that seemed to be coming from all around him. "Help me." The voice moaned, low and pitiful, as if it were clawing its way out from beneath the floor. He backed away, trying to keep calm, telling himself there had to be a way out. But then, one by one, the metal drawers began to slide open on their own, each revealing an empty, dark space that seemed to pull at him as if inviting him in. The whispers grew louder, more desperate. "Help me! I can't get out!" Ben's heart raced as he looked around frantically, searching for any other way out. The whispers grew into a chorus of voices, each one pleading, crying, desperate for help. His flashlight died completely, plunging him into darkness. He fumbled with it, trying to get it to turn back on, but the batteries were dead. In the pitch-black room, he could feel the presence of something moving closer, shuffling, dragging, getting closer and closer. He backed against the wall, clutching his useless flashlight, feeling the cold metal of the drawers at his back. His fingers found the edge of one, and to his horror, he realized it was slowly sliding open, forcing him forward. He tried to push it shut, but it was as if some invisible force was pulling it out, stronger than anything he'd ever felt. Then, he felt something icy brush against his arm, like fingers grazing his skin. He froze, unable to breathe, as those same fingers wrapped around his wrist, pulling him toward the open drawer. The whispers became a single voice, soft and hollow, whispering directly into his ear. "It's your turn now." With one final desperate scream, Ben felt himself being pulled into the drawer. Cold darkness engulfed him, his body wedged into the tight space, his screams muffled as the drawer slammed shut on its own. Ben was never seen again. A search party eventually went through the hospital, but there was no trace of him, only his flashlight lying abandoned on the floor in front of the morgue. The drawers were all closed, silent and undisturbed, as if they'd never been opened at all. To this day, the townspeople say that if you stand outside the hospital at night, you can hear a faint, desperate whisper drifting from the building, calling for help from someone who can never leave. A group of hikers had long prepared for this adventure, an overnight trek through the Appalachian wilderness. They planned to make camp deep in the forest, away from the trails, where the land felt untouched, ancient, and hauntingly silent. They were experienced hikers, armed with maps, supplies, and each other's company, but none of them knew the area's dark reputation. As dusk fell and they set up camp, they noticed how silent the forest had become. No insects chirping, no rustling leaves, no bird calls, just an eerie, unnatural quiet. They tried to shake off the unease, chalking it up to fatigue, and huddled around a small fire, talking in low voices. As the fire flickered, one of them noticed something strange, an old, rotting wooden sign nailed to a nearby tree, mostly obscured by moss. Peeling it back revealed a warning in faded letters, "Leave by nightfall." They laughed it off nervously. Superstition, they figured, but a subtle shift in the air seemed to change their mood. The fire crackled, casting shifting shadows against the surrounding trees, which now loomed over them like silent, twisted sentinels. Later that night, as they huddled in their tents, a distant sound drifted through the trees. A high, piercing whistle, like someone calling a dog. One of the hikers, a guy named Jamie, joked that it was probably a night owl or some other nocturnal animal. But then it came again, closer this time, sharper, more insistent, echoing through the forest as if the sound itself was alive and circling their camp. When the whistle sounded again, they realized it was too precise, too human. It was the kind of whistle you'd use to get someone's attention. They exchanged nervous glances, trying to convince each other it was just another camper, or maybe a hunter. Yet deep down, each of them felt the same gnawing fear. They hadn't seen anyone else in miles. Then came the footsteps. Crunching, deliberate, circling their camp just outside the light cast by their dwindling fire. Someone or something was walking around them, almost close enough to reach out and touch the tents. Jamie whispered to the others that it was probably a stray animal, but his voice was shaky. No one dared move. They sat there, gripping their sleeping bags, listening to the footsteps get slower, then faster, darting from one end of the camp to the other, as if whoever or whatever it was wanted them to know they were surrounded. The whistling returned, louder now, a tune that was unnervingly cheerful. It was as if someone were playing with them, waiting for them to make a move. One of the hikers, Katie, couldn't take it anymore. She sat up, trying to unzip the tent quietly, her hands shaking. But as she did, the footsteps stopped right outside her tent. She froze, hardly daring to breathe. Every muscle in her body tensed. A shadow fell across the thin fabric of the tent, motionless, and she could almost make out a shape, something tall and gaunt. Then slowly a hand pressed against the tent, just inches from her face. It lingered there, pressing hard enough that she could see the outline of each finger, its long, jagged nails. She clamped a hand over her mouth, trying not to scream, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it would give her away. The hand remained for what felt like hours, then as suddenly as it appeared, it withdrew. Silence fell again, a thick, suffocating silence that made them all wish for the footsteps to return, just to know where it was. But then from somewhere deep in the woods, a new sound emerged, a soft, distant hum. It was low at first, almost melodic, but as it grew louder, they could make out the words. It was a voice, chanting something in a language none of them recognized, repeating the same line over and over, the words chilling and foreign. They sat frozen, listening as the chant grew louder, as if a crowd of people were moving toward them. The footsteps began again, now coming from all directions, heavy and swift, pressing in on their camp. Terrified, they huddled together, clinging to each other, unable to think of a plan, just hoping they'd survive the night. Just as the footsteps reached the edge of their tents, everything stopped. The chanting, the footsteps, the whistling, all cut off in an instant, leaving only silence. Slowly as dawn broke, they gathered the courage to leave their tents, grabbing their gear in trembling hands. But as they turned to leave, they saw it. Around their camp, etched into the ground in what looked like blood, was a perfect circle, surrounding each tent like some ancient mark. They wasted no time packing, barely speaking, as they stumbled out of the forest. They never returned to that spot. Years later, when they tried to look it up, they found old records of a town nearby, one that had been abandoned a century ago due to strange disappearances. The townsfolk had left, claiming the woods were cursed, haunted by the spirits of those who had never returned. A man named Ben worked as a security guard on the night shift at a rundown hospital that had been partially abandoned for years. The newer wing was still functional, used mostly for storage and occasional overflow from the main city hospital. The older wing, however, was long out of commission, closed off with locked doors, caution tape, and warning signs. No one was supposed to go in there. The walls were crumbling, tiles missing, equipment rusted and covered in dust. Yet every night, Ben was required to patrol its halls, ensuring no one had wandered in. It was his third week on the job when he began noticing odd things about the old wing. He'd feel cold spots even though the air was warm and stale, and he'd hear faint footsteps echoing down the hall, always seeming to stay just out of sight. But worst of all were the voices. Soft, murmuring voices that sounded like distant conversations, whispers too quiet to understand. He told himself it was just his imagination, that the building was old, full of creaks and echoes. One night, as he was doing his rounds, Ben saw a light flicker on down one of the hallways in the old wing. This was strange. He knew he'd turned off all the lights when he'd last checked, and no one else was on duty that night. Cautiously, he made his way toward the light, his footsteps echoing in the quiet corridor. The light led him to room 418, an old operating room that hadn't been used in decades. He'd been in that room before, though it had always been pitch black and covered in dust. Tonight, however, the overhead light was on, casting an eerie yellow glow over the cold metal table in the center. Slowly, Ben stepped into the room, eyes scanning every corner, heart thudding in his chest. Then he noticed something that made him freeze. On the table lay a set of dusty surgical tools, arranged neatly as if prepared for surgery. But there was something else. A thick layer of what looked like dried blood, smeared across the table and splattered on the floor. He could have sworn it hadn't been there the day before. Swallowing his fear, he approached the table, reaching out to touch the tools. His fingers brushed against a scalpel, and in that instant, the light flickered off, plunging the room into darkness. He heard the door behind him slam shut, followed by the sound of something metallic scraping along the floor. A cold dread settled over him as he fumbled for his flashlight, but the beam only revealed empty shadows dancing along the walls. Then he heard it, a faint, wet whisper right by his ear. "You should not be here." He spun around, the flashlight sweeping through the darkness, but there was no one there. The voice was gone, and the room had gone eerily silent. His skin prickled, and he felt a chill settle over him, as if he were no longer alone. He sprinted out of the room, heart racing, not daring to look back. But as he reached the hallway, he noticed something even more chilling. The walls, usually dusty and untouched, were now covered in handprints. Hundreds of them, smeared in dark red as if people had been clawing to escape. They lined the walls, the floor, the ceiling, all leading toward the exit. Desperate to get out, he pushed forward, ignoring the whispers that now seemed to follow him down the hall. His footsteps echoed louder, almost in sync with another set, just a step behind him. As he reached the door to the main wing, he glanced back once more, just in time to see a figure at the end of the hallway. It was a patient, or at least it looked like one, draped in a hospital gown that was stained and torn. The figure was unnaturally thin, with hollow eyes and an empty, sunken face. It didn't move, but simply stood there, staring at him with an expression of sorrow, and something else, something like anger. Before he could react, the figure raised one skeletal hand and pointed at him, a silent accusation. With a shudder, Ben threw open the door and stumbled into the main wing, slamming it shut behind him. He didn't look back, didn't want to see if the figure had followed him. He ran to the security office, his mind racing, his heart pounding. He sat in silence, trying to catch his breath, telling himself it had all been a trick of his mind. But then he looked down at his hands and froze. There, smeared across his palms, was blood. 3 years ago, a college student named Sarah took a summer job as a night guard at an old rural cemetery just outside her hometown. The cemetery was historic, sprawling, and full of forgotten graves, some of which hadn't seen visitors in decades. Her only task was to walk the perimeter and make sure no one disturbed the graves. It was easy money, and she didn't believe in ghosts. But soon Sarah would realize that some things were better left undisturbed. The first few nights were quiet. She brought books, listened to music, and even took naps in the small guard's hut. Her rounds became routine, and the eerie quiet of the place began to feel almost peaceful. But one night, as she was doing her final patrol around the oldest section of the cemetery, she noticed something odd. At the edge of the property, near a cluster of crumbling tombstones, a figure stood perfectly still. Her heart skipped a beat. It was a woman, dressed in a thin, white gown, her face turned down toward one of the gravestones. Her skin was so pale it seemed almost translucent in the moonlight. Thinking it might be a grieving visitor who had snuck in, Sarah approached her carefully. "Excuse me," she called out softly, but the woman didn't move, didn't acknowledge her presence at all. Sarah took a few steps closer, feeling a chill creep down her spine as she got closer. She realized the woman wasn't breathing, wasn't moving a muscle. Suddenly, the woman's head jerked up, and Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. The woman's face was blank, almost like a mask. No eyes, no mouth, just smooth, stretched skin. And yet, somehow, Sarah could feel it looking at her, staring with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Her limbs froze as she realized that the blank face was somehow twisting, pulling back as if trying to form expressions that it couldn't create. Without thinking, Sarah stumbled back, her legs barely cooperating as she turned and ran, not daring to look back. She didn't stop until she was inside the guard hut, locking the door and pressing herself against the wall, heart pounding. She convinced herself it had been a trick of the light, her tired mind playing tricks. But as she sat there trying to catch her breath, she heard footsteps outside the hut. They were slow and deliberate, circling the small building. She didn't dare look out the window, but she could hear it. That same slow, shuffling step. And then, without warning, the doorknob began to turn, rattling softly as if someone were trying to open it. The shaking grew more insistent, harder, until the door itself began to tremble under the weight of the pounding. Terrified, Sarah grabbed her flashlight and clutched it like a weapon, bracing herself for whatever might come through the door. But just as quickly as it had started, the pounding stopped. The silence returned, thick and oppressive, and after a few moments, she dared to hope it was over. She spent the rest of her shift huddled in the corner of the hut, too afraid to leave. As dawn broke, she gathered her things and left, determined to never come back. But that morning, as she was leaving the cemetery grounds, she noticed something chilling. Near the guard hut, where the strange woman had first appeared, was a fresh, unmarked grave, a hole dug deep into the earth as if something or someone had crawled out from below.